In 327 BC, Alexander the Great began his invasion of India. During these campaigns, Alexander was accompanied by several prominent Greek philosophers who were believed to have exchanged ideas with contemporary Indian philosophers of the time. In the present day, there has been a surge of interest in both the ancient Greek philosophy of Stoicism and the ancient Indian philosophy of Buddhism, and many have noted striking similarities between the two. So could it be that these philosophies were in part forged by that epic meeting of minds from the East and West all those thousands of years ago?
One problem with answering this question is that I'm not a historian. Luckily, you don't really need any relevant qualifications to publish a video essay, so here are some interesting things that I read.
One of the philosophers who traveled with Alexander was a guy named Pyrrho, whose philosophy of Pyrrhonism, many have argued, has very clear Buddhist influences. According to one 3rd century biographer, Pyrrho's life and philosophical thought was profoundly altered by the ideas he encountered while traveling in India. Additionally, in the aftermath of Alexander's campaigns, a cultural syncretism, don't worry, I had to look this word up too, arose in the area around present-day Pakistan, which has become known as Greco-Buddhism, which led to some dope art and scriptures and other things, and I don't know, why don't you look it up?
When it comes to Stoicism, however, which I've mostly chosen to focus on because it's such a trending topic on YouTube, there doesn't seem to be any historic evidence for direct interaction with Buddhist ideas. So historical speculation aside, maybe the better question becomes, could it be that both Stoicism and Buddhism are trying to address the same fundamental human problems? Problems that, despite being philosophies that sprung up thousands of miles apart in very different ancient civilizations, are simply quite universal in nature. Well, now that I've pivoted away from history into the much more comfortable realm of pseudo-philosophical rambling, I will attempt to provide an answer. One idea that I think clearly links Stoicism and Buddhism is the recognition that it is our mind that causes us to suffer far more than any external circumstances. You may have heard this famous quote by Seneca.
The dichotomy of control is a central tenet of Stoicism, which emphasizes that, although we often have no control over the realities we are faced with, what we can control is our reaction to those circumstances. You can't stop the train from being late, but you can change how you react to it. You can't stop someone from posting an absolutely idiotic take on Twitter, but you can control whether or not you spend 20 minutes typing out a multi-tweet thread that carefully breaks down all the reasons that they're wrong, only to have them respond to only one small part of it, which ignores the context of all the other points you're making and effectively ruins your day. In contrast to Stoicism, which is a secular philosophy with a fairly straightforward lineage, Buddhism is a vast religion with many different schools and interpretations. That being said, especially here in the West, people often do practice Buddhism more as a philosophy and de-emphasize many of the supernatural and dogmatic elements. This is sometimes referred to as secular Buddhism, Buddhist modernism, or simply Western Buddhism. And for the purpose of this discussion, this is the lens that we are going to be looking at Buddhism through. I also have a separate video on this topic, if that might interest you. Okay, back to suffering. As it turns out, the concept of suffering is kinda a big deal in Buddhism. The primary goal of Buddhism is often described as the cessation of all suffering, otherwise known as enlightenment. Buddhism teaches that the root of our suffering is our attachments, desires, and cravings. So, taking the previous examples, we don't suffer because the train is late, we suffer because of our desire or attachment for the train to be on time. We don't suffer because an absolutely brain-dead psychopath on Twitter won't concede even a single point in our hours-long argument, we suffer because of our attachment to winning the argument. Of course, these examples may seem trivial, but Buddhism goes as far as to suggest that you shouldn't be attached to any material things, including your own body, and that clinging to mortality and fearing your own death are themselves deep sources of suffering. And for the most part, the Stoics agree. In the words of Epictetus, another similarity between Buddhism and Stoicism is the importance of living in the present. The Buddha says, and according to Seneca, now, I could keep going like this, just sort of pulling up quotes to show, hey, look how similar these ideas are. That's pretty cool. Or maybe we could go a little bit deeper and really get into the nuances of these two ancient philosophies to understand very specifically their similarities and differences. But I'm not really going to do that. And if you haven't figured it out already, if what you're looking for is a deep dive into the history and teachings of Stoicism and/or Buddhism, there are tons of books and even other YouTube videos by far more well-informed people than me that you could be checking out instead. So, I don't know, maybe just go do that. But hold on, let's take a step back. Way back. Imagine our distant ancestors living as hunter-gatherers. Although the world they inhabited and the challenges they faced were in many ways very different from those of modern society, evolution suggests that their brains were virtually the same as ours today. It has been theorized that many of the anxieties of modern life stem from a fundamental mismatch between a brain that evolved to live in nomadic tribes scattered across vast wilderness, but that now finds itself instead surrounded by thousands of humans all living together in massive concrete jungles. A commonly used example is the idea that natural selection programmed us to seek out calorie-dense foods, which is perfectly compatible with an environment where food is scarce but can be very damaging to our health in a modern world where food is plentiful and highly processed junk food is advertised in every grocery store. Another example is the idea that anger and retribution are useful in the context of a small tribe as a way to show your willingness to defend yourself and keep others from taking advantage of you, but when you are, say, caught in a bout of seething road rage, the anger only serves to potentially harm you, as whatever perceived enemy you see in that other car is ultimately just an anonymous person who you'll likely never encounter again in your life. And I'm not going to make another joke about wasting time arguing on Twitter, because if you actually think that's a good use of your time, I'm not sure what to tell you. Now, these theories, which often broadly fall under the label of evolutionary psychology, are far from a scientific consensus and remain the subject of an ongoing debate. But if you believe in evolution, it does seem to make some intuitive sense that given the rapid pace of human technological and cultural progress, we are at some level just highly sophisticated chimps that often struggle to cope with how quickly we've transformed our environment. Simply put, if the modern world makes you feel anxious, there might be a good reason for it. One of the things that often attracts people to both Buddhism and Stoicism is, despite being philosophies that are several thousand years old from ancient worlds quite different from our own, so many of the ideas seem to resonate just as strongly today. We may have iPhones and TikTok and YouTube channels that need to be subscribed to, but it seems that many of our problems really aren't that fundamentally different from those of the ancient Indians, Greeks, or Romans. The agricultural revolution is often cited as one of the most significant turning points in human history. It marked the beginning of civilization, the first time large numbers of humans were able to congregate and live together on the same land. But with the crowds came conflict. It's been suggested that humans are often better able to resolve disputes and share resources within small tribes in which everyone knows or is in some way related to one another. As more and more people come to occupy the same area, stronger authorities are needed to keep the peace, which leads to the consolidation of power into chiefdoms and eventually kingdoms and empires. It's against this backdrop that Stoicism, Buddhism, and many other philosophies and religions arose. It stands to reason that as societies become increasingly complex, there are simply more things to worry about, more conflicts to encounter, and more reasons to potentially spiral off into crushing existential malaise. The ultimate goal of Stoicism is often described as to live in accordance with nature. And Buddhism too has many references to returning to your true nature, or Buddha nature. Now, what nature actually means in any of these examples is the subject of many different interpretations, but studies have shown that spending time in nature has strong benefits for our mental and physical well-being. Which is one of those things that kind of seems like we don't necessarily need a scientific study to show us. As I said though, living in accordance with nature isn't understood to mean that you need to just go chill in a forest for a while. Nature, in this case, more means the natural flow or progression of the world. From a Buddhist perspective, I think it often refers to a recognition that underneath all the concepts and complexity we layer over our world, we are just simply living beings existing moment to moment, breath by breath. And it doesn't seem too controversial to say that people who live away from the chaos of cities and don't spend the majority of their days glued to screens may have an easier time recognizing this fundamental truth. But all this isn't to say we should all move out to the country or possibly revert back to a primitive hunter-gatherer lifestyle. All I'm saying is that it is probably a good idea to, metaphorically or literally, touch grass every now and then. That, so to speak. Nowadays, the sheer volume and variety of self-help content can be a bit overwhelming, so perhaps it's no surprise that many people prefer to turn to the tried and true wisdom of ancient teachings. I mean, I personally would much prefer to call myself a devoted Stoic or Buddhist than, say, a devoted follower of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, but to each their own, I suppose. Both Buddhism and Stoicism have had, and continue to have, a huge influence on many modern self-improvement solutions. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a widely used psychosocial intervention, yes, I also had to look this word up, that helps people escape negative thought patterns and irrational anxiety. The practice's founders have described Stoicism as providing the philosophical origins for their method. The practice of mindfulness is directly derived from Buddhism and has seen huge popularity in recent years, both in the context of simple stress relief as well as in clinical therapy settings. Now, in my opinion, it's not actually that hard to find a solid blueprint for living a better life and alleviating mental anguish. What is harder, however, is putting that advice into practice in a way that meaningfully improves your day-to-day existence. And another thing that connects Buddhism and Stoicism is they both emphasize the importance of regular practice. And while they both approach it from different angles, I believe that fundamental to both the practice of Buddhism and Stoicism is learning to closely observe the workings of your own mind. And I think this is important. As you make your way through this wild world, walking about in whimsical ways, it often feels like we just can't get a grip on what we're doing. We live in a storm of conflict between rational thoughts and emotional impulses and slow progress with endless setbacks where we just keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. Whether you believe that evolution simply wired us up for a life of inherent dissatisfaction, whether you believe we have some version of free will or are merely deterministic cogs in a long, strange causal chain that is the universe. What's kind of cool, at least so it seems, is that we really do have the ability to reflect on ourselves. We can observe our own thoughts and impulses, and however imperfectly, we can decide how closely we want to associate ourselves with those thoughts and impulses. Perhaps it's not true for everyone, but I believe that on the whole, as humans, we really do have the ability to radically change our behavior. And philosophies like Buddhism or Stoicism offer pathways to help facilitate those radical changes. Now, if it seems like I'm sort of oversimplifying these two ancient traditions that each have a rich intellectual history which people study for their entire lives and only scratch the surface of, while here I am, some know-nothing YouTuber who's just pasting in various quotes and tidbits I found online in order to string together some kind of universalist statement about how all human minds fundamentally struggle with the same problems, well, you might have a point. But on the other hand, it is nice to live in a time where so much of the world's wisdom, however repackaged or distilled down it may seem, is readily available to us. You may only have time for a 10-ish minute YouTube video, and ultimately you may wish that you had spent those 10 minutes doing something else, but you may also gain a new perspective from having watched it. And maybe that perspective does inspire you to adopt a practice of Buddhist meditation, or Stoic self-reflection, or something else entirely. I think what matters most is that you find something that works for you, that you actually feel like doing, and hopefully get some sort of tangible benefit from. Just maybe like not the Jordan Peterson stuff, and probably not anything Andrew Tate recommends either. I'd stick with Stoicism or Buddhism. I've heard Taoism is cool too, so maybe check that out.